The sky over the Arizona Territory had been dark since late afternoon, but by nightfall it had turned mean. Heavy storm clouds rolled low across the desert, swallowing the last light of the sun. Wind rushed through the canyon like a restless spirit, bending the tall grass and rattling the branches of the cottonwood trees. Then the rain came sudden, hard and cold, on the lonely trail that wound between the hills. A single rider moved through the storm. His name was Taza, a lone Apache who had spent most of his life learning the land rather than fighting it. His horse stepped carefully through the mud as thunder cracked across the sky. Rain soaked Taza's buckskin shirt and ran down the edges of his dark hair, but he did not hurry. Men who lived close to the earth did not fear storms. They respected them. Taza had been hunting in the high ridges all day and was now returning to his small cabin near the canyon creek. It was a quiet place far from the town of Red Mesa, where settlers and traders argued and drank while pretending to understand a land that was older than all of them. Taza preferred the D. Silence. Silence had been his companion for many years. Most settlers saw Apache men as warriors or enemies. Few imagined that some of them simply wanted peace. Taza had left the larger bands long ago after too many battles and too many graves. Now he lived alone, hunting, trapping, and trading furs in town only when supplies ran low. Trading furs in town only when supplies ran low. The town only when supplies ran. Storm didn't bother him, but something strange caught his eye along the trail. At first, it was only a shape, a dark bundle slumped beside the road where the rain had turned the ground into thick mud. Lightning flashed across the sky, lighting the valley in a brief silver glow. That was when Taza realized the shape was not a bundle at all. It was a person. He slowed his horse. The closer he rode, the clearer the sight became. A woman sat in the mud beside the trail, hunched forward like someone too tired to stand anymore. Her dress clung to her thin body, soaked through by the rain. The hem was torn and heavy with dirt from miles of walking. Her shoes were worse. The leather had split along the soles, and the skin of her feet showed through the broken edges. Yet despite the storm beating down on her, the woman still clutched something tightly in both hands. Small leather suitcase. She held it against her chest, like it was the last thing she owned in the world. Taza pulled gently on the reins and stopped beside her. His horse snorted softly, steam rising from its nose in the cold air. For a moment, the woman didn't move. Then slowly she lifted her head. Her face looked pale beneath the rain, and her hair, once neatly pinned, had fallen loose around her shoulders. Water dripped from the strands like tiny rivers, but it was her eyes that caught Taza's attention. They were tired tired they seemed almost empty, but deep inside them was something that hadn't broken yet. Hope. A thin, fragile kind of hope. The kind that survives only when everything else has been lost. Where are you going? Taza asked quietly. His voice was rough from long days without conversation. The woman blinked against the rain, studying him carefully. Many settlers feared Apache men, but at that moment she looked too exhausted to fear anything. I don't know anymore, she whispered. Her answer hung in the storm between them. Behind her stretched the muddy road that led back toward Red Mesa, nearly 5 miles away. Ahead lay nothing but desert trails and empty hills. Taza looked at her again, at the trembling shoulders, the broken shoes, and the suitcase she refused to let go. He had seen many travelers on these roads, traders, soldiers, miners, drifters, but none of them had ever looked like this woman looked now, not angry, not afraid, not just abandoned. Thunder rolled across the valley again. Taza knew one thing for certain: if he rode away and left her there in the storm, the desert would claim her before morning. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he leaned down from his saddle and extended his hand. "Come," he said simply. The woman hesitated only a second before placing her trembling hand in his. The woman's hand felt like ice when Taza pulled her up onto the horse. She was lighter than he expected, as if the long road had slowly taken pieces of her strength away mile by mile. For a moment she swayed behind him in the saddle, too weak to sit straight. "Hold on," Taza said quietly. She obeyed without a word, gripping the back of his coat with cold fingers while the horse turned off the trail and moved toward the canyon. The storm followed them the whole way. Rain poured from the sky in thick sheets, turning the desert paths into slick rivers of mud. Lightning flashed again and again, briefly lighting the jagged shapes of the distant mountains. Thunder rolled over the valley like heavy drums. But Taza knew these trails better than anyone. Even in darkness and rain, his horse found its way through the winding path that led to the small creek near his cabin. The cabin appeared through the storm like a shadow between the trees. It was a simple place, just one room built from rough pine boards, with a stone chimney and a narrow porch that faced the open valley. It had been standing there for years, long before most settlers even knew the land existed. Taza dismounted first and helped the woman down carefully. Her legs trembled the moment her feet touched the ground. "You're safe here," he said. She nodded faintly, though she looked too tired to truly understand. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of smoke, leather, and dry wood. A small iron stove sat near the wall, and a rough wooden table stood beside the window. The room was clean but plain, like the life of the man who lived there. Taza moved quickly. He knelt beside the stove and fed it dry kindling from a small box. A spark caught, then another, until a small flame began licking at the wood. Soon the fire grew strong enough to push the chill from the room. Behind him, the woman stood near the door, rainwater dripping steadily onto the wooden floor. She still clutched her small leather suitcase. Taza reached for a thick wool blanket hanging from a peg near the wall. Without looking directly at her, he held it out. "Wrap up," he said. Her fingers brushed his as she took it. They were shaking badly now, not just from the cold, but from something deeper exhaustion that had settled into her bones. She pulled the blanket tightly around her shoulders and moved closer to the fire. Taza poured hot water into a dented tin cup and added a handful of coffee grounds. The dark smell quickly filled the cabin. When the coffee was ready, he placed the cup on the table beside her. "Drink." She obeyed slowly, wrapping both hands around the warm metal cup. Steam curled upward in soft white spirals. For a long moment, she just held it there, letting the warmth soak into her frozen fingers. Then she took a small sip. Color slowly began to return to her pale face. The storm raged outside, rain hammering against the roof like thousands of tiny fists. But inside the cabin, the fire crackled steadily, pushing back the darkness. For a while, neither of them spoke. Taza sat on the other side of the table, watching quietly. Years of living alone had taught him patience. People spoke when they were ready. Finally, the woman lowered the cup slightly and looked at him. "My name is Clara," she said softly. "Clara Whitfield." Taza gave a small nod. "Taza," she repeated the name quietly, as if trying to understand it. Silence filled the room again for a moment, broken only by the sound of rain. Then Clara glanced down at the suitcase she had been protecting since the road. "I came from Ohio," she said. Her voice sounded distant, like someone remembering a life that belonged to another person. "My parents died last winter. Fever took them both in the same week." Taza listened without interrupting. "I worked in a textile mill after that," she continued. 12 hours a day, sewing shirts I could never afford to wear." Her fingers tightened slightly around the cup. "Then one day I saw an advertisement in the newspaper." She paused. "A rancher in Arizona looking for a wife." The fire cracked softly in the stove. And for the first time that night, Clara's eyes filled with something heavier than exhaustion. The memory of a promise that had brought her all the way across the country, only to leave her alone in the storm. The fire in the stove burned steadily, casting a warm orange glow across the cabin walls. Outside, the storm had not yet finished with the desert. Rain still drummed against the roof, though the thunder had begun to drift farther into the mountains. Inside, the small room felt quiet and safe. Clara sat near the fire, the wool blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The heat had slowly chased the cold from her body, but the exhaustion in her eyes remained. Her hands rested on the small leather suitcase that had not left her side since Taza found her beside the road. Taza noticed that she kept touching it, as if reassuring herself it was still there. After a moment, she slowly placed the suitcase on the table and opened it. Inside were only a few simple things: 2 folded dresses, a small comb, a thin handkerchief, and a bundle of letters tied together with kitchen string. She lifted the letters carefully. "They're from him," she said quietly. Taza did not ask who she meant. He already suspected. Clara untied the string and spread the letters across the table. The paper had grown soft from travel and rain, and the ink had blurred slightly at the edges, but the writing was still clear. "We wrote to each other for 3 months," she said. Her voice sounded steady, but it carried the weight of someone forcing herself not to break. "I saw the advertisement in the newspaper back in Ohio, a rancher looking for a wife in the Arizona territory. He said he was honest, hardworking, lonely." She paused, looking down at the letters. "He said he wanted someone to build a life with." Taza listened quietly. Clara continued. "His name was Thomas Reed." At that name, Taza's expression changed, just slightly, but enough that Clara noticed. "You know him," she said softly. Taza did not answer right away. He leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes fixed on the letters spread across the table. Finally, he nodded once. "Yes." Clara waited, hope flickering briefly in her tired eyes. "Is he a rancher?" she asked. The question hung in the warm air of the cabin. Taza exhaled slowly before answering. "He owns the trading post in Red Mesa." Clara blinked. That must be where he wanted to meet me," she said quickly. "At the depot near town." Taza looked at her carefully now. He told you to meet him there. Yes, she said. He wrote that he would be waiting at the stage station. He said he would be wearing a blue scarf so I would recognize him. Her hands tightened around one of the letters. I waited 2 days. The room grew very still. I slept on a wooden bench at the depot, she continued quietly. I thought maybe the stage was late. Or maybe something had delayed him. She swallowed, but he never came. Taza looked down at the letters. Again, there is something you should know, he said gently. Clara raised her eyes to his. Thomas Reed has a wife. The words seemed to freeze the air between them. Clara didn't move, and 2 children. Taza added quietly. For several seconds there was no sound except the rain tapping against the roof. Clara stared at the letters in her hands, as if they had suddenly turned into something unrecognizable. That can't be right, she whispered. But deep down, the truth had already reached her. Slowly, painfully, it began to settle. He wrote to me every week, she said faintly. He told me about the ranch, about the house we would build, about the horses he would teach me to ride. Taza said nothing. Clara's hands began to tremble. Then, without another word, she stood up and walked to the stove. One by one, she placed the letters into the fire. The paper curled immediately, the ink blackening as the flames consumed every promise written on those pages. 3 months of hope disappeared in less than a minute when the last letter turned to ash. Clara stood quietly staring into the flames. She did not cry. She simply closed the empty suitcase and rested her hands on the lid behind her. Taza spoke softly. You can stay here, he said. Clara didn't turn around, but after a long moment, she nodded. And for the first time since she had arrived in Arizona, the road ahead no longer looked quite so endless. The storm passed during the night, leaving the desert washed clean and quiet by morning. When the sun rose over the canyon, its light spilled across the valley in wide golden bands, warming the wet earth and making the creek beside Taza's cabin sparkle like silver. Inside the cabin, Clara was still asleep. Taza had risen before dawn, as he always did. Old habits stayed with a man who lived close to the land. He stepped quietly outside, letting the door close softly behind him so he wouldn't wake her. The air smelled fresh after the rain. For a moment he simply stood on the porch, watching the valley stretch out before him. The desert looked peaceful again, as if the storm had never existed. But when Taza thought about the woman sleeping inside his cabin, he knew the storm in her life had not ended so easily. He had seen many travelers pass through the territory over the years, miners chasing gold, soldiers chasing trouble, settlers chasing dreams. But Clara Whitfield had not come chasing anything. She had come chasing a promise, and promises were dangerous things on the frontier. Taza spent the morning repairing a section of fence near the creek. While he worked, the cabin door finally creaked open behind him. Clara stepped outside carefully. She looked different in the sunlight. The exhaustion was still there, but her face had more color now. She had washed her hair and pinned it neatly at the back of her head. The blanket still hung loosely around her shoulders. For a moment, she stood quietly on the porch, watching him. I hope you don't mind, she said. Taza turned. She held a broom in her hand. I noticed your floor could use sweeping. For a second, Taza looked confused, as if the idea had never crossed his mind before. Then he gave a small shrug. "Do what you like." Clara nodded and disappeared back inside Dot by the time Taza finished fixing the fence and returned to the cabin. The place looked almost unrecognizable. The windows had been wiped clean. The dusty table was polished. The dishes that had sat forgotten near the basin were now washed and stacked neatly. Clara stood near the stove stirring something in a small iron pan. The smell filled the room instantly. Cornbread. Taza paused at the doorway, surprised. "I don't take charity," Clara said without turning around. "If I stay here, I work." Taza didn't argue. He simply sat down at the table while she placed a warm piece of cornbread in front of him. He took a bite. For a moment he said nothing, but something softened in his expression. It had been years since anyone had cooked for him. Days began to pass in a quiet rhythm. Clara woke early each morning and worked around the cabin, cleaning, mending clothes, organizing things Taza had long forgotten about. She repaired a torn blanket, fixed loose boards on the porch, and even patched one of Taza's old shirts. Taza spent his days hunting or tending the land nearby. But each evening he returned to find the cabin warmer and brighter than it had been before. The loneliness that once filled the place slowly faded. One morning, about a week after Clara arrived, she surprised him. "Mr. Taza?" she said during breakfast. He looked up from his coffee. "Yes?" She hesitated slightly before speaking again. "Would it be all right if I planted something near the porch?" Taza raised an eyebrow. "Plant what?" "Flowers," she said. He glanced outside at the dry patch of soil beside the cabin. "You think flowers grow out here?" Clara smiled faintly for the first time since he had met her. "They do if someone cares for them." Taza considered that for a moment. Then he nodded toward the door. "Plant what you want." That afternoon, Clara knelt in the dirt beside the porch with a small hand shovel, carefully digging holes in the dry soil. From her suitcase, she pulled a tiny cloth pouch filled with seeds she had carried all the way from Ohio. She worked slowly, humming under her breath as she pressed each seed into the ground. From the fence line, Taza watched quietly. He told himself he was checking the posts, but when Clara looked up and caught him staring, he turned quickly and pretended to be busy with his hammer. Behind him, Clara smiled again, for the first time since she had been abandoned on the road. Something inside her felt like it might grow again, just like the small seeds she had planted beside the porch. For nearly 2 weeks, life near the canyon moved in a quiet rhythm. Clara woke early each morning, usually before the sun had fully climbed over the hills. She would open the cabin door to let the cool desert air inside, then begin preparing breakfast while the first light touched the valley. The small patch of soil beside the porch slowly began to change as well. The seeds she had planted pushed tiny green shoots through the dirt. They were fragile, but stubborn, much like Clara herself. Taza noticed. He didn't mention it, but every morning when he stepped outside, his eyes drifted toward those little plants. The cabin had changed too. Clean curtains now hung over the windows. The wooden table shone from regular polishing. Even the old rocking chair near the fireplace had been repaired and strengthened. The place no longer looked like the home of a man who had been living alone for years. It looked like the beginning of something else. But peace on the frontier rarely lasted long. One morning, an old rider appeared on the dusty trail leading to the cabin. The man rode slowly, guiding a tired gray mule behind him that carried a small canvas mailbag. It was Wilbur, the territory's mail carrier. He didn't usually stop at Taza's place unless something unusual had happened. Taza stepped onto the porch as the rider approached. Wilbur tipped his hat. "Mornin', Taza, mornin'." Clara stepped outside behind him, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. Wilbur's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he cleared his throat. "Bank in Red Mesa got robbed last night," he said. The words settled heavily in the warm morning air. Taza frowned slightly. "Anyone hurt?" "Not that I heard," Wilbur said. "But whoever did it cleaned out the safe. Took a fair bit of money, too." Clara stood very still. Wilbur shifted uneasily in his saddle. "Sheriff's asking questions in town," he added slowly. "Talking to anyone who's passed through the area lately." His gaze flicked toward Clara again. Just for a second. But it was enough. After Wilbur rode away, silence returned to the canyon. The wind moved gently through the grass, but the calm feeling that had filled the cabin for days seemed to disappear. Later that afternoon, Taza rode into Red Mesa to buy medicine for his horse. The town looked normal enough at first glance. Horses were tied along the wooden boardwalk, and a few men stood talking outside the saloon. But the moment Taza stepped inside, the room grew quiet. He could feel eyes watching him. At the far corner table, a man named Pete Tucker waved him over. Pete leaned forward and spoke quietly. "I'm telling you this because your father once helped mine," he said. Taza listened without expression. "Old Jenkins claims he saw a woman near town late the night before the robbery." Taza's jaw tightened slightly. Pete lowered his voice even more. "He says the woman looked like the one staying with you." For a moment, the noise of the saloon faded into the background. Jenkins was an old rancher who lived outside town. He was known for being half-blind and often confused, but that didn't matter much when fear started spreading through a place like Red Mesa. People wanted someone to blame, and strangers made easy targets. Taza left town quickly. Dust rose behind his horse as he rode back toward the canyon. When he reached the cabin, he found Clara standing on the porch, watering the tiny flowers she had planted. She smiled faintly when she saw him return. "I made supper," she said. "Beans and cornbread." Taza stepped inside without answering right away. They ate quietly at the table while the sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains. Clara seemed calm, but Taza could see the tension in her hands. She had noticed the way Wilbur looked at her that morning. Finally, she spoke. "The town thinks I did it, don't they?" Taza didn't lie. "Some people might." Clara stared down at the table. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she lifted her head again. "I didn't leave this cabin," she said firmly. Taza met her eyes. "I know." But outside, beyond the quiet valley and the growing flowers beside the porch, the town of Red Mesa had already begun whispering. And whispers on the frontier had a dangerous way of turning into accusations. The whispers from Red Mesa did not fade, if anything. They grew louder with each passing day. Clara could feel it, even though she remained miles away from town. Rumors traveled faster than horses on the frontier. Every passing rider carried a piece of the story, changing it slightly each time until the truth barely remained. The abandoned mail-order bride living with the lone Apache had become the easiest person to blame. Clara tried to continue her routine. She cooked meals, cleaned the cabin, and watered the small garden by the porch. But something inside her had changed. The quiet spark that had slowly returned to her eyes had dimmed again. One night, long after Taza had gone to sleep, she sat alone at the table staring at her small suitcase. The same suitcase she had carried across half the country chasing a promise. Slowly, she opened it. Inside were only a few belongings now. 2 dresses, a comb, a folded handkerchief, and the empty space where the letters had once been. She ran her fingers across the worn leather edges. "I can't do this again," she whispered to herself. Before dawn, she began packing when Taza stepped into the front room that morning. He found Clara kneeling on the floor beside the open suitcase. Her hands moved quickly, folding clothes with nervous urgency. He understood immediately. "You're leaving," he said. Clara didn't look up. "If I stay, the town will blame you too," she replied quietly. "You've already done more for me than anyone else in this territory. I won't let them take your land because of me." Taza leaned against the doorframe, studying her. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he walked to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee. "Sit," he said calmly. Clara hesitated. "Please." Reluctantly, she closed the suitcase and sat across from him at the table. The cabin was silent except for the soft crackle of the fire. Clara wrapped her hands around the cup. "But she didn't drink. I used to believe things happened for a reason," she said slowly. "My mother taught me that when I was little. I believed it even after my parents died. Even after I traveled all the way here for a man who never existed." Her voice faltered slightly. "But this makes no sense." Taza listened carefully. Then he spoke in his steady, quiet voice. "When my parents died, I was 14, he said. My brother sold the family land and left me alone. I nearly froze the first winter in that cabin." Clara looked up, surprised. "I stopped trusting people after that," he continued. "For many years." He paused before adding softly, "until the day I stopped on that road." Clara blinked. "You think there was a reason for that?" she asked. Taza shrugged slightly. "Maybe." The moment lingered between them, but before Clara could answer, the sound of distant hoofbeats echoed through the valley. Both of them turned toward the door. A rider approached along the dusty trail. It was the sheriff. Sheriff Dawson pulled his horse to a stop near the porch and removed his hat slowly. His expression looked different than the last time he had visited. Heavy, almost ashamed. "Morning," he said. Neither Clara nor Taza spoke. The sheriff cleared his throat. "We caught the men who robbed the bank." Clara froze where she stood. "4 of them hiding near the river hills," he continued. "They confessed to the whole thing." He looked directly at Clara. There was no woman with them. Silence filled the valley. "Jenkins got it wrong," the sheriff said. "The woman he saw had yellow hair, not dark like yours." Clara exhaled slowly, as if the weight she had carried for weeks was finally lifting. The sheriff lowered his head slightly. "Miss Whitfield, the town owes you an apology." Clara didn't smile. She simply nodded. Double quotes. "Thank you for telling me." Days later, Some townspeople came with small peace offerings, pies, bread, even flower seeds, but Clara no longer worried about their opinions. One quiet evening, she sat beside Taza on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert sky gold and crimson. She opened her suitcase one last time. Inside, she placed 3 things: the handkerchief she carried from Ohio, a dried flower from the small garden beside the porch, and a folded piece of paper. On the paper, she wrote one simple word: home. She closed the suitcase and set it beside the door, no longer guarding it like before, because the lone Apache, who had found her abandoned in the storm, had unknowingly given her something far greater than the promise she once chased across the country: a bouquet, place where she finally belonged.